just get started, and as people come, they'll just find us where we are. My name is Elizabeth Kamundia. I'm a research assistant here at the center. I was a student here in the first LLM that I graduated last year in 2012. Could we briefly just around the table introduce ourselves and sort of the LLM or undergraduate program might be that you're on, so that I have an idea, what you're doing starting here.
My name is Carl. I'm last year LLB. I did the art screen and got straight into last year LLB, so I'm a postgrad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to add
Oh
something?
no, I didn't know. So that's nice to say.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm Jacinta Hopkins. I'm in Carl's class, so I did the BA and now I'm finding your LLB as well.
Okay, you said Justina? Jacinta.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I have an awful time trying to spell Irish names, let me tell you. Yeah, go on.
This is Prem. Prem, P-R-E-M, Prem. I'm a student of International Comparative Design Law and Policy.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shauna.
Shauna.
I did the BA and I'm doing the LLB now.
Okay.
I am Jonathan, and I'm in the final year of the BA.
Okay.
I'm Jing. I'm the master program of the disability law and policy from the center. Thank you.
I'm Michael, and I'm in the same thing she's in.
Yeah.
I'm Windrad. I'm also the same. I'm doing the same thing that Lee and Michael
Yeah, okay.
said.
I'm Michael and I'm in final PCL.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm just finished the BA last year and I'm doing the LLB.
Did you say column? No?
Kieran.
Kieran.
C-I-A-R-A.
That's another one. Oh.
Just write it out.
Yeah, I think I will. I think I'll do just exactly that. Okay. Okay. So today really is on independent living and housing, and you'll notice a lot of today's is going to be on housing and people with disabilities. We'll do a little bit of theory, the theory behind independent living. We'll do a little bit more practical sort of stuff with regard to housing, and then let me see. We'll okay. So I'll try to answer as much as possible, given that I didn't do housing law, strictly speaking, here in Ireland. If there are any questions that I probably can't answer on the practical bits, I'll take them down and I'll take your email address and I'll respond. As soon as I speak, do some more research on them. Also, just to let you know, I was a volunteer here as well in my year. So how it used to go, and I'm sure you know this, is that beforehand so the client would come in beforehand and they make their complaints or whatever, then we take it down, so you're given time to research beforehand, so you won't just come up without knowing at all what you're meeting. So that's just important to have at the back of your mind. Okay, so I think let's get started. Okay, so I'll use the words independent living and community living interchangeably in a way, because in theory they've more often than not been used that way. Independent living more in America, in the American context, community living more in the European context. I don't know how many of us have a bit of background on disability law or disability issues, so that I know if I'm I know the LLMs have it, but the rest of us, so that I know if the detail I should go into when I talk about disability, or whether I can just gloss over it.
We don't put Annie from BA.
Yeah, no,
sorry.
No, that's okay. We'll just see as we go along. I'll try and put in as much like explanation as we possibly can. Okay, so okay, so I'm not sure we should begin with this then. Let me just say something really important about disability before even getting into this. The whole idea of it is, you probably had this in the first lesson, but I'll just repeat it again. The idea behind the current thinking on disability is that on the one hand, you have a person with an impairment. It may be visual, it may be sensory, hearing, it may be physical, it may be intellectual, it may be mental or psychological. That's on the one hand, an impairment, and that inheres in the body. On the other hand, you have the environment with barriers. And so, for instance, you have stairs, which in interaction with a physical disability, impairment, the disability results. So that disability then is not per se inherent in the body, but is the result of the interaction between the barrier and an inaccessible environment. So if you take the case of intellectual disability then, it's someone with a cognitive impairment, but if you want to provide information in simple language, for example, you could communicate with a person. But if you provide information in complex language, then you don't communicate with the individual, which means the disability is coming across because you're inaccessible. The information you're giving and the way you're giving it is inaccessible. Another example is some PDF formats that can't be searched. Do you know the ones when you key in the word, you can't just click the search button and come to, such documents may be inaccessible to persons who use screen readers, persons with visual. So it's not, so again, just going back to that whole idea of what disability is, there's a visual impairment in interaction with barriers in the environment, which is inaccessible formats online, then cause the disability. Otherwise, if you provide a document in accessible format, you're fine. You'll be on the same page. So I thought that was just important to introduce, and it's the human rights model of disability or the social model of disability. You'll hear that a lot as you go along, that we are, sort of away from the medical model of disability, because then the medical model of disability situated disability within the person. So the interventions were about fixing the person as opposed to fixing the environment. So it was about taking people with disabilities as patients, as people who were merely recipients of care, as opposed to individuals in their own rights. So yeah, I think just as a grounding, that's important to say. So before then we move to community living. So a description is that the whole idea behind community living then is that people with disabilities are able to live in their local communities as equal citizens with the support that they need to participate in everyday life. This includes living in their own homes or with their families, going to work, going to school, and taking part in community activities. Basically, a brief history, independent living or community living is said to have originated from America in 1972, thereabouts, in California, Berkeley, these pronunciation things, where people with disabilities who were in residential care felt that they, felt the way their life was restricted unduly because, as adults, and they started the first Center for Independent Living there, and basically that's where it came from. And the idea really is one of autonomy, asserting themselves as as equal adult human beings, as opposed to living in a residential place, which we will see as we go along, but I just thought a brief history might be important. So it's also important to note that the whole thing about community living was developed by people with disabilities themselves, sort of tired of things being developed by other people, services being developed by other people and brought down to them. So so that's just a bit of background. So then, yeah, so independent living then, again I'm using them interchangeably, independent living, community living, is provided for in Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is basically the, what shall we say, the international benchmark when it comes to rights of people with disabilities. As you go through this, as complaints come to you, Ireland hasn't ratified it, and there are discussions towards ratification of the convention. But if you wanted to know what the standard is with regard to any issue in disability, education, health, this is the convention to go to. So it's really the key document. And Article 19 of this convention then addresses living independently and being included in the community. Basically, state parties are required to ensure that persons with disabilities choose their place of residence on an equal basis with others, that persons with disabilities access a range of services including personal assistance to support inclusion and prevent segregation, that community services and facilities are available on an equal basis to persons with disabilities and are responsive to their needs. You know, if you read the convention, you'd see a lot more detail, but that's the gist of it. Please feel free to stop me at any time if I'm going too fast, or if there's something I say that you don't understand, the words don't convey the meaning meant. Okay, so then independent living, again a bit of philosophy that it's not so, okay, so it's not just about where a person lives, it's about inclusion and participation. And this is because people in many countries are confined to institutions and are therefore segregated from the community. In institutions, they are at risk of exploitation, violence, and abuse. Countless more people with disabilities are physically located in their communities, but are barred from meaningful participation in the life of their communities because either services are not available or communities are organized in ways that exclude them from participation. So I suppose this will come out better, and it's really the link to housing, in the sense that in Europe, as we'll see the exact statistics, but in Europe and in developed countries generally, the mode has been institutionalization, sort of getting disabled people and putting them in an institution where they are cared for, as opposed to providing services for them to live with their families and to take part in the life of the community. So that's the one hand. In developing countries then, like I come from Kenya, so in Kenya the situation is that there are no main big institutions. People with disabilities live with their families, but without the services that they need for meaningful inclusion to happen. So that either way, they are isolated and cut off from participation in society, which is the basic idea behind this whole independent living and inclusion in the community. So yeah, so that was just a bit of background on that. Yeah, so okay, so then so just going into a bit more detail again about what it's about. It's about self-determination. It's about people with disabilities having choices equal to others. It's about having equal access to services, so be it education, healthcare, just transportation, housing, equal access on an equal basis with everybody else. It's about support for living in the community, inclusion and participation. Again, something on institutionalization then. Over 1 million people with disabilities live in institutions across Europe. Human rights abuses again take place within institutions, and institutionalization is not an acceptable form of care in the world we are living in. It's incompatible with the right to community living. Yeah, I mean, if you think about what life is like for people with disabilities in an institution, it's, you know, you're adults, but you have a set time of waking up, you have staff who monitor you and watch you 24 hours a day, you have very limited privacy, you clearly cannot marry or found a family. So institutionalization then means that all your rights, you can't enjoy pretty much most, you know, if not all of your rights, and that's what's wrong with it. And then also a lot of people with disabilities who are, some of them may also be under guardianship as well, who, you know, who are in institutions, so which means basically that their legal capacity is taken away from them, so they can't enter into contracts. For example, their legal guardian is the only one who can. You know, sort of, if you equate it to children, sort of the way a child can't make a decision about where to live, it's the parent who does it. It's the same thing with people with disabilities who are under guardianship. So it's a really, and you know, it's a really abhorrent deprivation of human rights for people with disabilities. And I think this is important when you think about housing, which we will come to shortly, in terms of, can people, you know, obviously someone under guardianship can't sign a lease, you know, is not legally empowered to sign a lease, to enter into a contract, to get a house, or to get things for themselves. So, and the whole guardianship thing is Article 12 of the CRPD, if you'd like to look it up. They are very linked, Article 19 and Article 12 of the CRPD. Interest?
Yeah, I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. So then there are misconceptions about what independent living means. Some people think it's about a physical place, so that if you move people from massive institutions in which there are 800 people living, but you take them to like a residential house, I don't know, would anyone be living near a house or an estate that people with disabilities who are formerly in institutions have been brought to? Or would anyone know or have heard in the media about people with disabilities having been moved from the massively big institutions and into communities, in houses, in communities, and what the response of the people in the community was like?
For example, in China, the biggest psychiatric disability institute I visited is 300 people together, 300 beds. Yeah. Not thousands, not 800. The biggest I saw in Beijing, 300 beds, 300 patients.
Yeah.
And I didn't see any community setting in Beijing, but when I visit Hong Kong and Macau, there are some community settings, like 10 to 20 people
living
in a smaller institute, but this is a big building for normal people, you know. And then there are several apartments for this special people. I mean, So when I visit Hong Kong and Macau, they have the similar, like this
arrangements.
Arrangement.
Not bad,
I'm curious about here in Ireland. Would anyone have heard even of this whole idea of that we have these big institutions, but look guys, this is not the proper way to do things. Let's move people to the community. Would anyone have heard anything like that here in Ireland?
Where I'm from, I live in a state, and there's two different houses where people are living independently. Well, they have carers that change.
Yeah.
And there's maybe 5 people in each house, and they'd be like 4-bedroom houses. They'd be like normal size houses. But I don't know anything about institutions. I just know about independent living.
That's fine. That's I mean, the thing I'd like us to think about a bit. Okay, so we've dismantled, or we are in the process of dismantling these major big institutions, but when we move people to the community, are we creating real pathways for them to engage in community life, or have we just brought the institution down to a smaller sort of level, so that the same problems that were in an institution, just in a smaller scale, are in the smaller, sort of, it's set in a residential build, place. So, but is there real inclusion? Is there real participation in the things that happen within that community? I don't know. I suppose maybe it's too varying.
Sorry to interrupt
No,
you.
no.
When I visit Sweden, I visited the University of Uppsala with the professor help. I visit the local setting. It's only 5 people in one flight, 5 people with disability, and they have 24 hours services, like assistant for them. But these 5 people, they have the different work to some special place, but not in the normal place. So I thought in the future, in the old days, I thought that is a very ideal model for Chinese society. But with your lecture, I thought maybe that is also a special arrangement, because even if it's 5 people together, but they didn't work as a normal people. They just they just work in special settings.
Yeah.
Is that something you want to share
Yeah,
with us?
that's exactly what I want us to think about. Like, I'm not saying that there haven't been improvements, because obviously, God, they have, like, from that number of people to, but even as we think about that, then the next frontier is really creating bridges. And how do we do that? I don't know, I'm not proposing to have the answers, but like, how do we really actually make this deinstitutionalization meaningful, so that it's not just a shifting of resources, but a real change to people's lives. Yeah.
It sounds to me like the tendency is to go from maxi segregation to mini segregation.
Yeah, exactly. That's always the danger to watch out for with regard to these changes. Anyway, that's just food for thought. And of course, independent living isn't just about, it's not about people with disabilities doing everything for themselves. It's interesting because I did my dissertation on this topic, on Article 19, and I carried out research on it in Kenya because I was concerned about like in Europe, I could understand it a lot better in the sense that there are institutions and people are being moved to residential settings and hopefully included in the community. But in a place without massive institutions, I was concerned about what Article 19 means in practice. And one of the interesting things I came across then was that when I talked about independent living, I didn't really get a very nice reception, because people said, wait a minute, we don't want to... Independence is not particularly something we are aiming for. We are interdependent. We here in this Kenyan setting live in community with each other. We don't particularly think independence is something to aspire to as such. We prefer more interdependent. But of course the language of the convention is not interdependent living. So it was about now telling them that, look, the word independent living doesn't mean that you're isolated and you have to do everything yourself and you cut your links with your family and with your community. No, it's about those things we said before: self-determination, choice. And of course everybody wants those things. It's not a question of where they live. Everybody wants to be the deciding voice in their life, regardless of all those things. But it was interesting just finding how, when I called the same concept community living, there was a little bit more like, yeah, okay, we can identify with that, community living, more than independent. But anyway, so then in the context of Europe then, actions to implement Article 19 have focused on housing, understandably, because it's about, so people are moving from institutions to houses within the residential setups. So what are the kind of leases they'll find? So those are the more detailed things that I'd like us to go into over the next half hour. So a shift now, it seems like, student accommodation types. Okay, maybe student is the wrong title there. How housing sort of accommodation, the different accommodation types that exist. This is going to be quite a shift. That was theory. This is the drier part of law, the more dry practical part of law. Okay, so so what are the options? Okay, I'm sort of trying to link this with the kind of real cases you're likely to come across. You're likely to come across someone who has maybe moved from an institution, but the housing thing, or is in transit, but the housing thing hasn't yet been sorted out. So what are their various options? And what are them? Yeah, so it's quite a leap, but do stay with me. So these are the various accommodation. Okay, so there's renting from private landlords, okay, so clearly this is very student-centered. But still, so living at home, so no legislation covers it. Digs, where I suppose, a type of housing where a student, it's very student-centered again, stays in a family home with other students and pays a flat rate for lodgings and board, being provided with meals and stuff. And then social housing, which is what we'll focus on, which is a bit more relevant maybe to this discussion. Local authority housing and housing association tenant. Okay, so types of private tenancies. Okay, so these periodic tenancies, these Part 4 tenancies, and there's a couple more we'll see as we go along. All this is under the, let me find it just a minute, the Residential Tenancies Act of 2004. The Irish Residential Tenancies Act of 2004. And then the social housing is covered by the Housing Acts. So, okay, so
Elizabeth, you will share the PowerPoint for us, right?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I will.
because the word is too small.
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry, I'll try and read out everything. Sorry, I'll try and we'll put it up on, no, but we can't put it up on Blackboard because not all of us access this. Anyway, we'll figure it out. We'll figure out how to get it to you. Okay, so periodic tenancies, no fixed amount of time, can be weekly or monthly depending on when rent is paid, should have a written tenancy agreement, should have a rent book, can become a Part 4 tenancy after 6 months, and I'll explain what a Part 4 tenancy is. Termination of tenancy, okay, so as you'll see below, so Part 4 tenancies are automatically acquired after 6 months of renting. They have increased security of tenure regarding termination. They can last for 4 years. Okay, so once you've lasted somewhere for 6 months, the Part 4 tenancies part of the Act is applicable to you, and it lasts for 4 years and can then be renewed. Then fixed term tenants can claim Part 4 tenancy by notifying landlord in writing 1 to 3 months before the end of the fixed term. Then Part 4 tenancy apply automatically to periodic tenants. Moving along, then fixed term lease and tenancies. So fixed term tenancies last for a specific period of time. Tenants cannot be asked to leave during this time, provided they are abiding by the lease terms, usually with a written lease agreement, must respect the legal rights of tenants and landlords, for example, regarding entering without permission, but we look into the rights of the landlord and the rights of the tenant as we go along. Joint lease agreements mean that all lessees are responsible for rent. Tenants can only end agreement if the landlord is in breach in terms where they have notified the landlord of the breaches to no avail. If the tenant wants to assign the lease to someone else or sublet, they must inform the landlord in writing. Tenants should have the original lease and the landlord keeps a copy. Rent arrears must be notified to the tenant by the landlord. Then if arrears are not cleared, the landlord can issue a termination notice, giving 28 days notice. And then residential tenancies, so now the particular obligations of landlords. So, okay, the landlord must register the tenancy with with the Private Residential Tenancies Board, allow the tenant to enjoy peaceful and exclusive occupation, respect tenants' privacy, comply with standards regarding all those things, damp, heat, wiring, and I mean this is also relevant to you with regard to housing and sort of knowing your rights with regard to housing. So even if a question doesn't come specifically on housing, you'll be at least more informed about what your particular rights are. At the very least, at least I thought so as I went along and like doing the research on it. The landlord is obliged to insure the dwelling, to provide a point of contact so that you can reach him if you need to discuss an issue, to promptly refund deposits unless rent is owing or there is damage beyond normal wear and tear, to reimburse tenants for expenditure on repairs that were appropriate, to enforce tenant obligations, not to penalize tenants for making complaints or taking action to enforce their rights. And then Residential Tenancies Act, so what are the tenants' obligations? A tenant is obliged to pay rent and any other specified charges, to avoid causing or make good any damage that's beyond normal wear and tear, to notify the landlord of any repair needed, to allow access by appointment for repairs to be carried out, and routine inspections, to keep the landlord informed of the identity of the occupants, to not engage in antisocial behavior, to not act or allow visitors in a way that would invalidate the landlord's insurance, to not cause the landlord to be in breach of statutory obligations, and to not alter, improve, assign, sublet without the written consent of the landlord. Okay. Then residential, so now more on rent. All tenants should have a rent book or a written contract or lease. How many people are renting? It will be interesting in this house. Do you have any of these things?
No.
Do you have a rent book?
No.
No, you don't?
We didn't have signed any contract.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, so this is the law. Yeah, so this is the law. Rents should be set at market rate. Rents can be reviewed once a year unless substantial work has been done on improvements. Tenants must get 28 days notice of new rents. Tenants can ask the landlord for a rent review if it's more than a year since the last rent review. Then disputes should be referred to the Private Residential Tenancies Board. And then, so what are these rent books I'm talking about? This is what they should contain. An address of the rented dwelling, the name and address of the landlord and his agent if any, name of the tenant, term of the tenancy, amount of rent, when and how it is to be paid, details of other payments, for example, telephone, TV, amount and purpose of any deposit paid and the conditions under which it will be returned to the tenant, statement of information on basic rights and duties of tenants, landlords and tenants, inventory of furnishings and appliances, other information about the tenancy. All payments to landlords must be recorded in the rent book or in another written statement. Like at least you should get a receipt for your payment. Okay. I mean, at the very least, or maybe pay by bank something. At least protect yourself. Pay in a way that, at least ask for an account. Pay in a way that you can prove that you are paying something. Otherwise, should a time come that you need to enforce those rights, kind of becomes difficult. Even if the law actually recognizes both written and oral contracts, still, it's always easier to prove things when you have written, when you can show something solid. Okay, termination of tenancies. Tenancy can be terminated without reason within the first 6 months, as long as it's in writing and it's signed. Part 4 tenancies, that is those after 6 months, must have specific grounds for termination. For example, non-compliance with terms of the agreement, intention to sell on the part of the landlord, required for own use on the part of the landlord as well, and maybe non-compliance with terms that were agreed upon beforehand. And then the period of notice required, less than, so if it's less than 6 months, 28 days notice, 6 months, 6 or more months but less than 1 year, 35 days, 1 year or more but less than 2 years, 42 days notice, 2 years or more but less than 3 years, you should get 56 days notice, or you should give 56 days notice. 3 years or more but less than 4 years, 84 days notice. 4 or more years, 112 days notice. Yeah.
All these things are mentioned in that red book.
They
in
are.
This one red book, yeah.
Do you have a...
Yes, I have.
Okay. Clearly some people have more secure tenancies in this room than others. Yeah. Do you have it here by any chance? It might be interesting for people to... Do you have it here?
No,
No, you haven't. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So applying for social housing. So local authorities provide housing to those in need of housing and who are unable to afford it themselves. You apply directly to the local authority for direct provision and housing association, but must be, okay, so you must be on the local authority waiting list. You can apply to only one local authority at a time. You must be resident in the local authority area or have a connection there. That is, you've lived in the area for 5 years, you're employed in the area, or you're in full-time education or receiving disability service in the area. The local authority will carry out a housing needs assessment. So bringing it back to practical matters. So maybe a person with disabilities will come here and ask regarding how they go about applying for social housing. And so, yeah, so I have here a sample of the housing needs assessment. I'll pass it on, but just to go through it a bit, what it contains is, okay, so this is the 2013 housing needs assessment form for South Dublin County Council. So, you know, so the usual details, your name and everything, but of your name, date of birth, PPS number and everything. But of interest to us then is the whole idea of disability stroke medical information. So part of the form requires you to fill in this. So it asks whether anyone in the household has a disability or medical condition, yes or no. The person's name, the details of disability or medical condition, and then if someone in the household has a disability, please indicate if the disability falls into any of the following categories: intellectual, physical, mental, sensory, etc. Due to the disability or medical condition, are there any particular requirements needed in a home? So you kind of begin to see then what the link is with housing, because okay, so if yes, please describe the particular requirement. For instance, wheelchair access needed. So basically, my understanding of it is that local authorities can either make an actual change to the layout of the house as much as possible, or if it's a private residence, give particular grants for making it accessible, or making it accessible to a person with disability, so that people with disabilities are able to access housing on an equal basis with others. I'll pass this on in a minute. Let me just see if there's something else I wanted to highlight from it. So I actually asked today how well the local authorities actually do these changes. Like, do they, or is it just on paper? So my colleagues actually confirmed that they do, particularly with regard to physical disabilities. So they will to a large degree make, like, ensure, like, have houses that have wide corridors, have houses whose toilets can be, you know, used by a person with a physical disability, because these are like the practical things you have to think of when you're thinking about what an accessible house is, how wide are the doorways, are there stairs or steps getting into various parts of the house, so sort of all that. They will either do it themselves or they'll give an allowance for it. I'll have at the end of this a section on websites and sort of links that have more in-depth details about what are these grants, how do you apply for them, but it's just important to know they exist in the first place. Yes,
yeah, Elizabeth, according to your formal volunteer job experience, for the person with disability who really want to have her own housing arrangement, how long he need to wait?
In the waiting list?
Yeah.
That would be interesting to ask, actually. I don't know how quick houses on local authorities are, but I think I have a criteria on how they, let me see now, waiting lists. Okay, so if you're accepted by the housing authority as being eligible for and in need of housing, you're then placed on its waiting list, now known as the record of qualified households, and the housing authority will also notify any other housing authority in whose functional area you have specified as an area of choice. Bear with me. Each housing authority draws up its own rules for deciding the order of priority on the waiting list. So you can get a copy from the housing authority. So you have to look up, like in a specific housing local authority area, what's the waiting, what are the rules, what's the priority for allocating a house in that area. So some housing authorities operate a points system, giving each household on the list a number of points depending on its circumstances. So for instance, I'm sure you have someone unemployed, are most of the people in the house elderly? I'm just thinking off the top of my mind, like practical things they might look at. How many people have a disability in the house? Are they employed? Are they not? Just practical things. And then they have this point system. And then if you want to know your position on the waiting list, ask your housing authority. Your position may go up or down depending on the circumstances of other people on the waiting list, and as your own circumstances change. In practice, priority is generally given to families and older people rather than single people or couples without children. Yeah, makes sense. But like to your specific question, which was how long, I'd have to note down that and ask, like, after all this, approximately how long does it take? I don't know. I definitely have to ask that. Yeah.
Because if in the future when we work as a volunteer, some people ask us, oh, I'm eager to live independently, give me the housing arrangement. How we answer?
How long? Yeah, that's an important question. I'll confirm it. I mean, I could possibly even just make a call before you all leave, and I'm sure someone will know, definitely. Okay, I was supposed to circulate this.
Is it a lot more difficult then for disabled people to get social housing because of the effort the government the council will have to go to? Where like they could say, before houses here, we can give 3 of them away straight away and then convert the last one kind of thing?
Yeah.
Or would they say the top 4 people are all prioritised or disabled, so we're going to have to wait and convert all the houses?
It would be interesting to find out how it really happens practically on the ground. Again, I should try and wind up quickly so I see if I can actually just call my colleagues and like hear from them, because you can only research theory, but like the practical situation on the ground would definitely come from an Irish person. So I'll make the call.
I just want to share you a very interesting example. In Hong Kong, it's a very small city. So the Hong Kong government couldn't provide like this, So they established an institute, just like I mentioned. So there is a very long waiting list for move into the institute. For example, for the person with intellectual disability, normally the family have to wait more than 10 years before sending their boy or girl to the institute, And so it's a very long waiting list.
Yeah, and I mean, I asked actually that question about what if the support you need is not an adjustment to the house, it's personal assistance.
Yeah.
You know,
That's the reason we are not demanding the institutionalize. Institutionalize how many people they can be, fit in certain institution. That's the reason we say, more than 15% people are with disability in one way or other. So, and if we really want to make them independent and productive citizens, or protecting their human rights, they should be living in the community and then they should get assistance or support or
within
whatever,
the community.
what's labeled they need.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. People with disabilities should. I mean, if you take the statistic you've given that 15% of the world is constituted of people with disabilities, then you clearly can't have institutions or think like that. We need to think of practical ways for people to be able to live in their own homes or with their own families in the community. So yeah, I agree with you, Mindras, on that. And I will ask, so let me see if I can. Oh yeah, I was saying something that, okay, so if the kind of support you need to be able to live in this house is more than physical adjustments, I asked my colleagues what happens, and they said the grant for personal assistance comes from the Department of Health, HSE, yeah, the Department of Health, so that it's a separate grant and it doesn't link up or tie up with housing at all. So that for personal assistance or for support person of any other kind comes from HSE. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so yeah, so we've gone through that whole idea of awarding of points and that local authority and housing tenants have tenancy agreements. I don't think this is very relevant. So let me make the phone call. I think it would be a bit more important to tie in and to sort of finalize on the disability aspect of it. So the response then is that the average waiting time can be up to 2 years, but usually not longer on the waiting list, and that it depends on the local authority as well. So it might be much less time or much more time. And then regarding your question on housing and whether having a disability and the fact that they're going to have to change things makes it more difficult for people with disabilities. She said that houses built since 2005 are generally required to be accessible, right? And that with regard to social housing estates, I think 20% of the houses have to be accessible, so that increasingly lots of houses are actually accessible, but also that just the mere fact of having a disability can't make them you'd have a legitimate complaint, and I think there's a slide here on complaints mechanism if they keep you indefinitely because they don't want to make the change. But she said mostly they wouldn't. Mostly they just allocate it based on their point system. So so local authorities then support adaptation grants, mobility aids grants. Then there's a rent accommodation scheme that's applicable after 18 months for people on rent supplement. It's an additional grant, and you apply directly to the local authority. And then the Department of Social Protection, HSE, deals with the whole idea of rent supplements, and people are usually means tested by community welfare officer for eligibility for all these variety of grants, and there's a mobility allowance as well that is provided to people with disabilities. Then equality legislation. Okay, so then where do you look for a remedy? So your rights have been infringed as a tenant or just as a person with disabilities seeking housing. there's equality legislation. The Equal Status Act prohibits discrimination on 9 grounds. Disability is one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination. It applies to provision of goods and services, including accommodation. So there's direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and discrimination by association. And basically, direct discrimination, I'd say, is where just by virtue of your having a disability, you're denied housing or any other service. Indirect discrimination tends to apply a standard that on the face of it looks neutral, but actually in reality prejudices certain people. And then
wait, if the people with disability need the housing to do some accommodations, if the landowner refuses to do it, it's an indirect discrimination. Even if she said, okay, you can rent my house.
I'd actually argue that's direct discrimination, considering that denial of reasonable accommodation. Do you remember that whole idea of reasonable accommodation and how it relates to discrimination? Denial of reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation is defined in Article 2 of the CRPD as necessary and appropriate modification and adjustment, not imposing a disproportionate burden where needed, to ensure that basically it's any adjustments or change that you may need either to a facility or the way a service is given, to ensure that people with disabilities access that service on an equal basis with others. So it's very broad, reasonable accommodation. But so if they say that it's expensive and they don't want to take a person with disabilities, I'd say that's direct discrimination, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be direct. Let me see if there's anything else I've left out. Yeah, so discrimination by association happens where a person associated with another person who belongs to the discriminatory grounds is treated less favorably because of that association. You must prove that the person has a disability as defined in the Act. There's, the Act has a specific definition. So there's really many definitions of disability. The CRPD has its definition. Different acts will have their definition. And so for these housing issues, for these equality issues, you have to meet the threshold that is set in the Equal Status Act. I think this is it, actually. Must qualify as disabled under terms of the Act, that is the total or partial absence of a person's bodily or mental functions, including the absence of a part of a person's body, the presence in the body of organisms causing or likely to cause chronic disease or illness, the malfunction, malformation, or disfigurement of a part of a person's body, a condition or malfunction which results in a person learning differently from a person without the condition or malfunction, or E, a condition, disease, or illness which affects a person's thought processes, perception of reality, emotional or judgment, or which results in disturbed behavior. Clearly, this is a very medical model definition of disability. Nothing about barriers or attitudes or, those other things. But yeah, that's the threshold one has to meet. And then, okay, trying to get us to go to the next slide, which isn't working out very well. So I think I'll just use this. Okay, so then there's the Equality Tribunal. In the first instance, so when there's an issue in the first instance, the person should try to sort out the problem directly with the landlord. If there appears to be an unresolved case of discrimination, you can complain to the Equality Tribunal. You must write to the respondent against whom the complaint is being made within 2 months of the incident, stating that you will make the complaint. If you're unhappy with their response, must refer the complaint to the Equality Tribunal within 6 months of the incident happening. The tribunal will offer mediation or conduct an investigation. Formal hearing of complaints then happens and the decision is binding. And then finally, Okay, so finally, those are the useful contacts. When you get a case and it touches on housing or all these issues, look at the Citizens Information Service, Threshold, Private Residential Tenancies Board, Equality Tribunal, Galway Center for Independent Living, or Disability Support Service here at NUIG. And mostly you'll find the websites really useful. I have to say the websites have a lot of information and yeah, they're useful.
Elizabeth,
Yeah.
for the people with disability,
Sorry?
oh, I mean, for the person with disability,
Uh-huh.
got the domestic abuse, for example,
Uh-huh.
he or she want to move out as soon as possible.
Uh-huh.
How can he or she find some help about the housing arrangement in this emergency?
Okay, I'm sure, I think on a first case basis what I'd think is that what happens for other people if there's domestic abuse, the police are involved, so that should happen for people with disabilities as well. So I'd hope that the police would, the station will be accessible so that the person can actually make the complaint. That's in the first instance. Then I'm sure, I don't know, is there emergency housing here? I know in some states there is, yeah? Like safe houses or, yeah. Would you?
They have women's refuges.
They have,
go in.
For women, right? In China, we still have for women, but not for the disabled.
No, I think they'd be accessible.
Yeah, because remember, Jing, again, the discussion we had, we had another class in which we talked in depth about equality, and we had a discussion about people being not just disabled, but we have multiple identities. So you're disabled, you're a woman, you're old or young or a child, you're not just one thing. So if you are abused and you're a woman with a disability, then you're also a woman, not just a person with a disability. So you'd go to the shelter that women who are abused go to. So it's just keeping in mind all those multiple layers, and a person is not just one thing,
Yeah.
there are many.
But the problem is, if it's a man got abused, and because in China, for the shelter, is managed and administrated by one department of government authority. It's not the disability part, So
Yeah.
if the person with disability, some emergency, he couldn't apply that shelter for women because it's the other government agency
Yeah.
business, It's different.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and I know people. I mean, when you're confronting government and bureaucracy, there's that tendency to be moved from place to place, and you belong here and you belong there. So I may not know your jurisdiction well enough, like to answer exactly where the person might go, but yeah, I mean it's an important point. Yeah. Midras, you were saying something about
here
Europe.
in Europe, definitely, they're more systematic.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, yeah, so class or training session is over. Unless someone has a question or would like, about anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.